Here's the uncomfortable truth about lobbying. It's basically impossible to completely separate it from the First Amendment without either neutering one of our most fundamental rights or pretending we have a different political system than we actually do. But that doesn't mean we should accept the current state of lobbying either, because there's a massive, massive difference between allowing people to petition their government and allowing wealthy interests to drown everyone else out. The question isn't really whether lobbying should exist, it probably has to, but rather what kinds of lobbying should be permitted and how we can make sure it actually serves a democratic purpose rather than just serving the wealthy. So let's start with why people defend lobbying in the first place. The First Amendment explicitly protects the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. When you look at that language, you realize lobbying, at least in its basic form, is essentially what it's describing. If you or I call our representative to complain about a new regulation, that's called lobbying. If we organize with others to make our voices heard, that's also lobbying. So if you want to ban lobbying entirely, you're technically trying to ban a constitutionally protected activity, and courts have already suggested that this would be pretty difficult. Well, beyond the legal issue, there's actually something legitimate about the informational argument for lobbying. Congress members can't possibly be experts on every complex issue they vote on. That's not a problem with their representatives so much as a problem with human cognitive limits. When well-designed environmental regulation or legislation, depends on understanding specific technical details about how pollution actually works, or when health policy requires expertise on disease transmission and medicine side effects, having people with genuine knowledge present that information to lawmakers seem actually useful. This isn't inherently corrupt, it's about filling an information gap that almost certainly exists. There's also a democratic argument that lobbying can give voice to groups who otherwise might not get heard. A civil rights organization lobbying for voting rights protections, or disability advocates pushing for accessibility standards, or environmental groups fighting for clean water regulations, these aren't obviously corrupting influences. They're groups trying to make sure their interests get represented in a system where representatives obviously can't personally know everyone affected by their votes. If you make lobbying illegal, you end up silencing the marginalized along with the powerful. But here's where the real problems start. The issue is not lobbying itself. It's that modern lobbying has become so expensive and professionalized that it now functions almost entirely as an access tool for wealthy interests, which completely changes the democratic equation. Consider the scale of what's happening. Corporations spend billions annually on lobbying. We're talking about resources that vastly outpace what labor unions, environmental groups, or consumer advocacy organizations can possibly mobilize. When lobbying spending is one-sided, but where all the lobbyists either support or oppose a bill, research shows it dramatically predicts the outcomes, with one-sided opposition associated with a 26 percentage point decrease in the probability a bill even passes. That's not about informing lawmakers, that's about killing legislation through pure financial firepower. The research on regulatory capture makes this concrete. One study looked at a state utility regulation and found that when restrictions on corporate campaign contributions were lifted, companies more than doubled their political donations and successfully got regulators to approve higher rates. This wasn't happening because the utilities had better technical arguments, it happened because they had more money to spend on access and pressure. When lobbying becomes this professionalized, it creates a fundamental inequality in whose voice actually matters. 1,000 citizens might support a policy, but if they can't afford professional lobbyists, then legislators rarely even hear directly from them. Meanwhile, a single corporation or industry group can hire the best people in Washington and ensure the lawmaker gets their perspective in person repeatedly. Now, the revolving door makes this worse. More than 460 former members of Congress currently work as lobbyists. This isn't an accident, it's because those connections are what clients are actually paying for. A former representative doesn't bring expertise. They bring relationships and insider knowledge of how to manipulate the legislative process. This creates ongoing networks between government service and private interests that blur the line between public services and just positioning yourself for a lucrative post-government career. That's not democracy, that's an institution that's partially serving the interests of a professional class rather than the public. Now, you might push back and say, okay, but could you just increase transparency and regulate lobbying rather than banning it? Hire independent investigators, require disclosure, enforce actual penalties for violations, and honestly, you're not wrong that this would be better than what we have now. The problem is that enforcement has essentially broken down already. The Federal Election Commission which is supposed to police campaign finance and lobbying rules, has been deliberately weakened through partisan deadlock in between 2012 and 2019, deadlocked on enforcement matters more than it actually pursued violations. Dark money groups operate illegally with basically zero enforcement consequences. It turns out that once money becomes the central force in politics, regulating money through a government that's been through thoroughly lobbied to stay weak is just not effective. There's also the polarization angle that's worth taking seriously. Though it's messier than it first appears, research shows that individual donors, because they tend to be ideologically motivated, support more extreme candidates, while traditional PACs represent businesses' interests support more moderate candidates because they want access to whoever wins, regardless of the party. You might think this means restricting lobbying from organized interests would help reduce polarization, but here's the catch. If you restrict organized interests while leaving individual donations unlimited, you may actually make things worse by amplifying the voices of the most ideologically committed donors. This doesn't mean you shouldn't restrict lobbying necessarily, it just means the solutions are interconnected in complicated ways that aren't immediately obvious. The strongest counterargument to restricting lobbying is probably the constitutional one, though I think it's weaker than people act like it is. Yes, the First Amendment protects petition rights, but we already restrict lots of forms of speech and petition without constitutional crisis. We have rules about what foreign nationals can contribute. We have fraud laws that limit what certain speakers can say. We have disclosure requirements for certain forms of communication. The Supreme Court's Citizens United decision insisted that restricting corporate independent spending violates free speech. But not all judges agreed that was obviously right, and plenty of democracies restrict corporate political spending while maintaining vibrant free speech protections. The First Amendment isn't an absolute principle that defeats all competing interests. It balances it against other values at a time. What I propose is a complete ban on organizational donations and lobbying by corporations and unions, combined with strict individual contribution limits, $1,000 annually per person, adjusted for inflation, and real enforcement mechanisms. This is genuinely more restrictive than government law, and I get why some people think it goes too far. But if you look at what the evidence actually shows, that current campaign finance and lobbying structures now function such that policy outcomes align much more with wealthy preferences than with ordinary citizens' preferences, that 80% of Americans believe donors have too much influence, that the influence operates through mechanisms that have nothing to do with the quality of arguments, you start to see why I make this case. The real tension is that we can't have it both ways. We can have a system where lobbying is essentially unrestricted, and anyone with enough money can dominate legislative processes. Or we can have a system with meaningful restrictions on organizational money and professional lobbying combined with real enforcement. But we probably can't have unlimited money flowing through lobbying while pretending we're maintaining democratic equality, because the evidence suggests we're not maintaining it, we're gradually replacing it. That said, there are legitimate concerns about my specific proposals. A complete ban on organizational lobbying might be overkill. Maybe what we actually need is not to eliminate lobbying, but to fundamentally change its economics so that the advantage wealthy interests have is sharply reduced. You could imagine a system where public financing of campaigns dramatically reduced the dependence on private donors, or where certain sectors of lobbying are more tightly regulated while others remain relatively free. Different democracies have found different balances on this, and there's probably no one perfect answer. The evidence does seem pretty clear that we can't just leave things as they are. Voters know something is wrong, they perceive government as being captured by wealthy interests, and it turns out that perception reflects something real, not just cynicism. Whether the answer is a comprehensive ban or some alternative approach, the status quo of professional lobbying dominated by corporate money isn't working. The question is whether we're willing to actually do something about it. Knowing that means having a harder conversation about what we're willing to restrict in the name of preserving actual democratic equality. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, and only if you liked this kind of video, please do like and leave a sub. It does help a lot. I spend a lot of time on these videos, so it would help a very large amount. Thank you for watching and have a good day.